19, and I do realize, as I want to preface this, I realize that we kind of covered 18 2 weeks ago. Scott definitely covered it last week, and I want to go back and cover the end of it this week. So if you feel like we're repeating ourselves, I apologize. But I keep thinking I haven't really made this point, or I haven't developed that, and plus it really is the climax of the book, and John himself spends much of his time dealing with this. It is the destruction. It's the destruction of the rebellion against God, and he is going to kind of in chapter 19. He's sort of going to repeat himself from what he's saying in chapter 18. So I don't feel too bad about repeating myself, but I do apologize if it's not maybe the best way of presenting material. If it's belabored, I apologize. But I'm going to go ahead and backtrack just a little bit. I know that you covered a little bit of this last week, but we're going to discuss a few points I don't think that were made only because we just didn't get to it. It's not because we just neglected them. There's just not enough time. So anyway, so let's look at Revelation. We're in the last vision. Now the sixth vision, that is a repeat of the fifth vision that we just had. He's going to go back. He talks about the destruction in chapter 18, and he's going to replay it in chapter 19 almost immediately. It seems that in the first introductory visions, he spends more time setting up the destruction, or setting up the scenario, and then spends very little time on the judgment. You know, in the first vision, it's the judgment. All the judgment is there was judgment for half an hour, or there was silence in heaven for half an hour. That's the judgment. That's all that's spent on it. And then when you get to the sixth vision, he spends very little time talking about the scenario, about men choosing sides in their devotion or their opposition to God, and then he spends more time on the actual destruction. And so you can kind of see that transpire across the different visions. Less time on the situation, more time on the destruction. So as we get into 19, we'll cover that. Now I want to go back up a little bit and talk a little bit about the destruction of society, or destruction, and some people argue Jerusalem, some people argue Rome. I want to go back and in fairness to Wallace and Shelley and other commentaries that I mentioned last week or 2 weeks ago, I do have a couple of quotes I want to read. I should have had them 2 weeks ago, but I do want to go back and cover them. But let's go back to Revelation 18, 19 to 21. And they threw dust on their heads as they wept and mourned, crying aloud, "Alas, alas, for the great city, where all who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth. For in a single hour she has been laid waste. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, for God has given judgment for you against her." And then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, "So will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence and will be found no more." Now, this millstone, I mentioned this 2 weeks ago in passing. I'm going to go into it in more depth about the imagery that he is using. It is not new imagery. He is repeating imagery that's already found in the Old Testament, specifically Jeremiah. So, now when we're talking about Babylon, the question is, well, what is Babylon? He's talking about maritime traffic. Now, neither Babylon nor Rome were really coastal cities. Now, Rome, we think of it kind of as a coastal city because it's so close to the Mediterranean, but it's not really right there on the shoreline. But they were both in charge of great empires, and so even though they weren't sitting there on the coast, we're talking about not just the city itself, but all of its dominion. But it is kind of interesting, the imagery that he's using. It doesn't really fit the city of Babylon itself, and it doesn't fit the city of Rome itself, and so that's what leads to a lot of speculation. What could it be? What does it mean? Who is he talking about? Or Jerusalem? And Jerusalem is not known as being a maritime city. So when they're applying this or answering this question, well, what does it apply to? That's where you get into some speculation that Babylon is really being used as a symbol for things far greater than Babylon itself, or even Jerusalem, or even Rome. Before your eyes I will repay Babylon and all who live in Babylonia for all the wrong they have done in Zion, declares the Lord. I am against you, you destroying mountain, you who destroy the whole earth, declares the Lord. And there he refers to Babylon as a mountain. If you think about the 7 hills of Rome, the hills and mountains all throughout the Bible always represent great powers. I will stretch out my hand against you, roll you off the cliffs, and make you a burned out mountain. No rock will be taken from you for a cornerstone, nor any stone for a foundation, for you will be desolate forever. And so this simple illustration of a stone, sometimes the illustrations of the Bible are so precise and so, for want of a better word, simple, they go over our heads. Because it's so clear what he's saying, people stop to even think about how to apply it. But he's basically saying, okay, Babylon, you're a mountain, okay? You think you're this huge power, this huge, and he compares it to a rock. And there's no bigger rock than a mountain itself, right? It's the part of the earth. And then he says, you'll be worthless, and there won't even be enough of you to be used in a building of any other structure. That's how complete your desolation will be. And at the end of the chapter, he says, Jeremiah had written on a scroll about all the disasters that would come upon Babylon, all that had been recorded concerning Babylon. He said to Sariah, when you get to Babylon, see that you read all these words aloud, and then say, Lord, you have said you will destroy this place so that neither people nor animals will live in it. It will be desolate forever. When you finish reading the scroll, tie a stone to it and throw it into the Euphrates. And then say, so will Babylon sink to rise no more because of the disaster I will bring upon her, and her people will fall. So he compares Babylon to a mountain, and then he literally takes the scroll, ties it to a very small stone to contrast it with that mountain, and throws it in a rock. And there's nothing more insignificant as far as a rock is concerned is a pebble in the middle of a river. And what river is that? It's the river that they've dominated and claimed for all of humanity, the Euphrates, which is the very river that John mentions over and over and over again in Revelation. And it is that imagery that John is tapping into. And to read Revelation and not make the connection between just the greater message of what Jeremiah is saying in chapter 51 is probably unwise. And yet people miss it. They don't, when they discuss it, we don't even bother to make the connection. And the sound of harpists and musicians, of flute players, of trumpeters will be heard in you no more, and the craftsmen of any craft will be found in you no more. The sound of the mill will be heard in you no more, and the light of a lamp will shine in you no more, and the voice of a bridegroom and bride will be heard in you no more. For your merchants were the great ones of the earth, and all nations were deceived by her sorcery. And in her was found the blood of prophets and of the saints, and all who have been slain on the earth. He repeats himself. When you're trying to explain, if I was a college student and I was trying to explain word by word, I probably would struggle with this verse because the imagery is it's so declarative. There's nothing to interpret. The destruction is complete. He uses the word no more at least 5 times. And he is simply explaining the destruction. So what then is he talking about? Now, in fairness to Wallace, I wanted to quote Wallace just so that, I should have done this 2 weeks ago, apologize, but I want to go ahead and say it now. The approaching fall of Jerusalem under the symbol of Babylon was envisioned in this chapter. It pictured the overthrow of Judaism and the Jewish state as having been actually accomplished, when in fact it was an apocalyptic forecast of an event still future, described in the details of past occurrence. Now, let me back up 2 steps. When we're dating Revelation, it's important to note that Foy Wallace disagreed with the 98 AD date. He was convinced that this was written in the mid-60s, and that John is talking about the destruction that's going to happen in 70 AD. So that is what Wallace said. I want you to see it. I want you to see this is what the former editor of the Gospel Advocate thought it was. To those that say, is this Rome? More than once, John had found comfort for himself and his people by proclaiming the fall of Rome. So certain is he that God will judge the persecutors of the church, that he now devotes 2 chapters to an account of that crashing down of the fabulous grandeur that was Rome. To say directly that God will destroy imperial Rome would have been, of course, together treasonous in the eyes of the imperial authorities. So like a prisoner writing in code from a concentration camp, John characterizes the power of evil as Babylon. Though a Roman official of even moderate intelligence could not fail to see his mother city reflected in a text that spoke of a city set on 7 hills that held a dominion over the kings of the earth. Just as Babylon represented to the Hebrews all that was wicked and symbolized persecution, so for John, Rome was another Babylon, the source and fountainhead of all seductive luxury and vice, living in voluptuous materialism and selfishness. And that's a quote from Bruce Metzger. How did I find this quote? Well, actually, I went and was trying to go back to Shelley's commentary, which was written in the early 80s, to pull a quote from there, and I put in Shelley at Revelation, and I ended up getting taken to a presentation that he had given recently in the last 3 or 4 years. So this is something that Shelley is still teaching. He used this quote in that presentation, and so I thought that was just as good. So he's basically putting forth that view. Now, notice what he says. Though a Roman official of even moderate intelligence could not fail to see his mother's city reflected in the text. Right. So when people are adhering to the futurist interpretation of Revelation, I can have great sympathy for that, because when you look at what is going on in modern society, it is very easy to see society itself as reflected in the words of John. So Wallace's application makes sense. Of course it does. Everything that Jerusalem has done, everything that's mentioned here, Jerusalem did it. Everything that was mentioned here, Rome did it. So it's perfectly clear that this application can be made. Now, where the disagreement is, and this is friendly disagreement, this is not, this has nothing to do with, I'm right and they're wrong, or Kaufman's right, they're wrong. That's not, I may be wrong. I think that the reason it is written in apocryphal language as such is because it is describing the phenomenon that happens with all civilization, all rebellion against God, from the beginning of time to the end of time. And it's not concerned about specific events. We want it to apply to specific events because we're convinced that Rome is a book of prophecy, and it is, but our conception of prophecy may not be quite what we think it is. It's not concerned about the times and the seasons. As Jesus said, it is not for us to know that in Acts chapter 1. So when we see any society rebelling against God, we can take the message here in Revelation 17 through 19 and apply it to what's going on. And not get involved in the game of, well, what's going to happen? When is Christ coming back? Christ will come back at any time. But the message that is in Revelation 17, 18, and 19 needs to be heard right now, all the time. And we need to preach it with our full strength. Is this all humanity? And to quote Wilbur Smith, that the fall here presented is that of the apostate Christianity, the world religion that has betrayed Christ and is interlocked with pagan, godless governments. That's what he believes. And Burton Kaufman, the art, music, architecture, and culture of our whole civilization are in large measure the achievement of the harlot. Volumes could be written about one of these. Apostate religion is championing family. It defends monogamy, although it allows exceptions. It is with the individual in birth. It is marriage and death. It is responsible for the educational infrastructure. It has preached virtue despite very flawed leadership. We have validated kings in return for protection, and we have protected the social order, and we gave order and purpose to the average man. All of that is done by apostate religion. It has preserved scriptures despite hiding them. We preach consequences for sinful behavior. We believe in higher power above earthly flaws. We have provided hope for all mankind despite our own heresy. We have cherished life, and even though we seek to protect it. We have cherished life and we seek to protect it. We've offered salvation for the individual and not the collective. And that is something very specific to Christianity. Christianity has always talked about the salvation of the individual and has refrained from being too concerned about society. Now, and by that I mean there's many other religions that it's all about the preservation of society itself. Christianity, even apostate Christianity, tends to break that. It tends to say, okay, it really is about the individual, and at least speaks to the idea that society is wrong. Although when it's actually talked about in a public square, people are never going to sit there and say, yeah, that king is evil, or this entire society is corrupt. There's always some kind of accommodation. Chapter 18, I mentioned already, borrowed from Jeremiah 51. When you look at the opulence of the world, we get scared that what we see here can easily become that. It can easily go from greatness to complete destruction. We don't want to hear it, but it's happened over and over and over again. When I was a little kid, I liked to tell jokes. I mean, what kid doesn't, right? And I had to discover humor, like what makes people laugh. Now, I'm still not very good at it, but I try. When I was a little kid, I was very fascinated with the program Gilligan's Island. I loved that show. And I watched it every day on reruns. And there was one particular line in the film, or in the show, that I just thought was hilarious. But when I would tell people, I tried to tell it as a joke to people, and they would just look at me and be like, what are you talking about? It's not funny. And that was a show where Gilligan is lamenting about everything that has gone wrong. We're going to run out of food. They're stranded on the island. And he's talking to the skipper, and he says, he mentions all these bad things. And the skipper says, we got this, we're going to do this. It's not the end of the world. And Gilligan responds to him and says, it doesn't sound like the end of the world, but it certainly sounds like the end of us. Now, when I told that joke, people didn't make people laugh, but I was thinking about that particular line. That's kind of how I feel about Revelation. It may not be, I look around at society and I get panicked and think, well, maybe the end times are coming, but then I realize it may not be the end of the world, but there are certain trends in society that certainly make me think it may be the end of us. Now that is a fair application. There's something going on Tuesday that you may or may not know about. It's probably late.
Yeah.
Okay. Now I've really enjoyed Ryan's lessons, and and he can articulate some of this much better than I can. Okay. But I want to take it a little bit different angle. We kind of, some people approach this as, I'm not going to be interested in politics. I'm going to focus on God and what's going on in my personal life, and I'm really not going to worry about it. Okay. And as far as individual behavior is concerned, I think that's a good approach, right? But then when we look around and we are flooded with messaging, just constantly inundated with what is going on in the world, it is certainly evident that it is far more important to a lot of other people than it may be to us, okay? And people are really worried about it, and they are really panicked, okay? And you get in and you see a lot of, I certainly feel it this way. I certainly knew there was a rivalry between different factions when I was a child, but man, it seems to have gotten a lot worse. And to the idea of, we kind of say, well, we don't need to be concerned about it, and we don't need to worry about it as far as pushing our particular political belief over someone else's. And I want to, and I believe, that's generally a good message to have. Even if we think that we may have the correct political view over someone else, and I do try to think, well, my politics are motivated by Scripture, but Brian in the last week, talked a lot about how we can let that. We often, if we spend too much time getting involved in politics, it can work the other day. It actually, we're very capable of letting our politics, dictate our religion. I do want to say, when I say what I'm about to say, I want to try to make this relevant to what we're discussing in Revelation 18, and speak in very broad generalities, and just talk about the chaos that I kind of see out in society. A lot of people in these different factions, they start ridiculing each other and calling people fascists, as if they know what that actually was, as opposed, it's not some random nationalist movement rooted in 1920s Italy. Okay, they're going to apply it to anybody they don't like. And then you see other people take the terms Marxist, and they throw that around and apply it to anyone they do not like. And they without, knowing necessarily, the idea that the average man really knows exactly what fascism was, or what Marxism was, or how the economics of both models worked in society. Has anyone actually gone back and read Karl Marx, Frederick Engels, or Antonio Gramsci or Lenin, or any of the writings of those ancient philosophers? And the answer is no. Okay, they haven't done it. We throw these terms around without really knowing, okay, what did they mean? And it's kind of irrelevant, what those philosophies actually were. The problem in the world is sin, and the problem is our own rebellion against God, and how it's manifesting itself is very troublesome and very problematic. And so some people might believe, and I used to believe this, that if I called something out and I gave it a label, that I would somehow shouting a warning to the world. And by doing that, people would see it and would prevent prevent it from happening. People will read the Diary of Anne Frank, and they'll say, how could we prevent that from happening? How could we let that happen? And the answer is, well, it wasn't up to one individual person, and it certainly wasn't going to be reversed by one person standing up against the multitude and sort of shouting the warning, and people all say, yeah, he's right, this is evil, we're going to stop it right now. Okay? That's not really how it works. One man cannot stand up and reverse hundreds of years of sin, or decades of sin. It's sort of it's a phenomenon of a rebellion against God. It proliferates until destruction comes, and society will destroy itself. And when you go back and you look at I'm not saying this is going to happen. I'm not a prophet, nor the son of a prophet. I'm not saying it's going to happen in the next 5 years or 50, but I am going to say that eventually something's going to happen. It may be 100 years from now, but something's going to happen. And that regardless of whether we're in the middle of an open war or a rebellion or conflict or factionalism, the nature of man is the same. We're always in rebellion, and we're always going to be seeing sin. So when I look at the labels and I see the factions going back and forth with each other, you might say, well, this faction might be right and this faction might be wrong, and you might be able to offer a good justification for that. And when you go back and you look at societies that have boiled down and collapsed and completely turned against themselves and brought absolute utter destruction on themselves, the way those factions, there was oftentimes factions within society. It's not like one person came along and said, I'm going to be dictator. I'm going to be dictator. I'm going to take over the world. I'm going to oppress my enemies. There were factions on both sides of whatever political discussion it was at the time. And if I was to describe some of the the fights in politics, like 1920s Italy, for example, or 1930s Germany. I mean, it wouldn't mean anything to you. It would be very obscure items lost to history. Okay, but there were factions. There were different enemies. We talk about the Reds in taking over Russia, but we don't talk about the Whites. The Bolsheviks had the Mensheviks. We talk about Mussolini and the fascists, but we don't mention Antonio Gramsci because Antonio Gramsci lost, right? But he was just as evil. Now, I'm not saying that the different factions here in America should be equated to the different factions of history, and I'm not saying people are evil. I'm just saying, or particular individuals are very, very evil per se. Don't go there. I'm just saying that in general, when you look at the behavior, you have to look at all the behavior across all of society, and when people start going back and forth against each other, that is the sign of the society. The factionalism itself is the problem. How it plays out, yes, someone might have more reason here than the other, but ultimately, if we don't all get back to living righteously, we're going to fight about these issues that really don't matter in the grand scheme of things. We think they matter because we're worried about our destruction and our salvation, and we should, in that regard. But what I'm saying is that we wouldn't find ourselves in conflict with our fellow man if we were living correctly. Now, that doesn't, it kind of gets back to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. You have all these different groups of people in the churches of Corinth. I'm of this household, I'm of that household. And that's true. And then he tells them to not engage in that factionalism, but then in the 11th chapter he says, well, there have to be two factions among you ultimately, and that is those who are right and those who are wrong. I mean, there is, that's a 1 Corinthians 11:18. So I don't want to overstate, I don't want to overstate something or obfuscate what I'm trying to say. There is right and there is wrong, but the fact that there is factionalism, people going back and forth without speaking to who is right and who is wrong, the fact that we're fighting so much is a problem. And how we go about correcting it is maybe cannot just be fixed by saying something louder and articulating it more than the other person. I want to go back and I want to just, look at some past events about how some of this played out. Now, I have a quote here. It says, the national government will regard it as its first and foremost duty to revive in the nation the spirit of unity and cooperation. It will preserve and defend those basic principles on which our nation has been built. It regards Christianity as the foundation of our national morality and the family as the basis of national life. Well, that sounds fine. That sounds like a good quote, right? Except he didn't mean it. And who said that? Oh, it was his baby. Well, that's a cute baby. But it was Hitler, of course. And then Hitler also said Christianity was the first spiritual terror entered into the far freer ancient world. The world has been afflicted and dominated by this coercion, and that coercion is broken only by coercion and terror, only by terror. Only can a new state of affairs be constructively created. So what did he mean? Which one did he mean? Well, he clearly meant the latter. By their fruits you shall know them. You see, it's been our misfortune to have the wrong religion. Why didn't we have the religion of the Japanese who regard sacrifice for the fatherland as the highest good, or the Mohammed religion, too, would have been much more compatible to us than Christianity? What did it have to be? Why did it have to be Christianity with its meekness and flabbiness? So he had no intention of keeping Christianity as the state religion. Other quotes from other individuals. Our religion is without a doubt the most ridiculous, the most absurd, and the most bloodthirsty ever to infect the world. This is Voltaire. This is what he thought about 18th century Christianity. It is impossible to believe in peace with people whom one believes to be damned. To love them is to hate God. To punish them, they must be redeemed or else tortured. Wherever theological intolerance is admitted, it must have some civil effects, and as soon as it has them, the sovereign is no more sovereign, even in temporal matters. From that time, priests are the true masters, kings are but their officers. This is Rousseau. It is therefore the task of history, once the other world of truth and religion has vanished, to establish the truth of this world. That is Karl Marx. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, the soul of the soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. You see this common theme among all of those guys. Okay? They are going to unburden themselves from the shackles of what they call this terrible problem of religion. We rebel, we take our religion, we corrupt it, we want to accommodate our lifestyles, and we can only do that to a point. And finally, society says enough and believes that religion itself is the problem and tries to take it out and tries to undo society from the very base. And so the good things that apostate religion can accomplish, that's kind of held society together for a while, at some point it just unravels. That seems to be the message. That seems to be the message of Revelation 17 through 19, in my opinion. And I say in my opinion, I may be wrong. Other quotes: since monogamy was caused by economic conditions, will it disappear when these causes are abolished? And finally, did we not see that in the modern world, monogamy and prostitution are inseparable and the poles of the same social conditions? So, I mean, he's rejecting the family as a social construct and not something ordained by God. That is the type of thinking that we're dealing with. And we're going to undo all that, and we're going to usher all that in, and we're going to rebuild society the way we want, and we're going to burn ourselves to the ground in the process. And that type of thinking is all throughout the world today. You can you hear people talking about God, and you hear people talking about religion. They want to absolutely reject it entirely. Search for the paradise on this earth is futile, and people who reject God end up coming to the same conclusions about how they're going to rebuild society. And that's why sometimes it does appear. I mean, there are two sides. I mean, there are the bad and there are the good, and eventually, the evil in the world reaches critical mass that is going to burn down everything that is good. Obviously, evil, good, and good live in each of us, but eventually it does catch up to us. These locusts that have flown out of the crevice that we see in the earlier part of Revelation, they just harm those who commit the sin at first, but then when they go away, they come back, and the armies of all that is horrible in the world is going to come back and destroy the society. At first, it just harms individuals, but then eventually it hits critical mass and it kills everybody. And how does that manifest itself in a democratic republic like ourselves? I mean, we believe that we are protecting the individual freedom of everybody. And I would just say that, and how does that happen in the past? How have we fallen to tyranny in the past? In a society of innumerable factions divided by morality, religion, and politics, the easiest factions to unite are those who have no morality, no religion, and no politics, which is why the worst get on top and then set on civilization on fire. This is how we go from peace, justice, and equality to let's kill all the Jews and the Christians. I mean, that is what happens. And I think that's kind of, John is saying stuff that can be applied to the nature of humanity and not to one specific event. And then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, so will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence and be found no more. Okay? And the sound of harpists and musicians, I've already read that, I'm sorry. So that is Revelation 18, and then you go into Revelation 19, After this I heard what seemed to be the loud voice of a great multitude in heaven crying out, Hallelujah! Salvation, glory, and power belong to our God, for his judgments are true and just, for he has judged the great prostitute who corrupted the earth with her immorality. And this is the beginning of the sixth vision, and he's going to describe what is, he's describing the situation, and then in the last half of 19, it's going to happen over again. Because he just destroyed Babylon at the end of 18, but we're going to destroy it again. Once more they cried out, Hallelujah. The smoke from her goes up forever and ever, and the 24 elders and the 4 living creatures fell down and worshipped, saying, God, who has seated on the throne, saying, Amen, Hallelujah. And from the throne came to a voice saying, Praise our God, and all you his servants, you who fear him, small and great, the marriage supper of the Lamb. There is disagreement on whether these 5 verses belong to the previous vision or to the next vision. Some say the passage is transitional. His judgments are righteous; they are not cruel. Today, it seems that the only sin that we have in our modern society is to call something a sin. But certainly, we need to remember the verses of Matthew chapter 7 and 1 Corinthians 11:31, which I've already mentioned. That there are certain, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall inherit the kingdom of God, but those who do the will of my Father. And there are ultimately 2 factions, good and evil. But how that plays out in the modern political world may be very, very, very unclear. And it can, and the fighting will be is a sign that we are ourselves as a people unhealthy. I don't really want to interject the writings of particular political philosopher and try to put my stamp on it and say, okay, we need to accept this as something good. But there's one particular writer that if you take some of the stuff that he wrote and you put it through a biblical filter, a lot of it comes out intact, and a lot of that is Tocqueville, who himself was a very religious man. He was famous for saying that, he would not be able to understand the justice of God, but he would always attribute his failure to do so as his own weakness and failings, and not to the Lord himself. That God is in control, and God's justice would be manifest throughout society. But one thing that he points out, he said, it is vain to summon a people who are so dependent on the central power of the government to then choose the representatives of that power. And then sit back and marvel at how evil their own politicians may be, as if that evil originated with the politicians themselves and not within the citizenry at large. They are a reflection of how we behave and how we operate. And no one will believe that a wise, freedom-loving government can spring forth from a people that cannot govern themselves. And that is our problem. We are an immoral people. And we know it. We can look at it and we can see that we are sinful. That's why you're seeing so much chaos in the political world. And and the election of one particular candidate is not going to fix the problem. I was talking to someone the other day, and they're like, "Well, if this person wins, do you think, what do you think is going to happen?" I said, "There's going to be a fight." And he said, "Oh, if that person wins, what if the other person wins?" There's going to be a fight. There's going to be a fight. I mean, the fight's coming. I mean, it doesn't matter who wins this election or that election, because it's going to continue. It's not like we're going to wake up Wednesday and say, "Oh, we can go back to being friends again." That's not going to happen, and we know it. We've got a lot to pray for, and we've got a lot to be concerned about. But the message is, again, we have not in our lifetime been faced with any kind of existential threat to our existence or society or way of life. That is a coincidence. That is a mathematical coincidence. Just because it hasn't happened in our lifetime does not mean it won't. If that were to ever occur, the message of hope and the message of hope and love is still waiting for us in the Bible. We have to go back to that and live life one day at a time, and take care of our families, take care of ourselves, take care of our church, take care of our souls in regards to how we obey God, and we know that His grace will save us, because we will always fail in that regard. But don't be worried. Just don't be worried about what's going to happen. Just have faith, and God loves you.